So we are joined today by Christopher Anders, who's a U.S. Asylum, primarily an asylum lawyer. Am I right? Am I right, Christopher, to say that?
That is right.
Yeah. So Christopher and I met. It was quite a number of years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but I was down in the US doing some speaking at various events in the Portland area, and I think
Hmm.
we met up at some of those.
Hmm.
Um, but um, as many litigators know, or people just watching the news, there's been a lot of talk about the Safe Third Country Agreement in Canada. It's something that's being litigated a bunch. It's something that came to the forefront in my practice when I started seeing clients who were coming across who had even made claims in the United States and were kind of caught up in a very tortured process,
Yeah.
and then ended up having to leave. But then, of course, because of having made a claim in the US, were precluded from doing so in Canada. So this is kind of what prompted us to bring Chris on the show to just talk a little bit about what the current situation is with respect to the asylum situation in the United States. And just we're just going to have a free flowing conversation here about what the current climate is there so that we can run some comparisons to what we're experiencing here in Canada.
Yeah, I
Um,
think in both countries, Canada and the United States, asylum flows are dominating the political landscape and is probably, as we've discussed on the podcast going back years, but probably most specifically our episode with Petra Molnar, is dominating Western politics from Canada, North America into Europe. Um, and kind of getting a sense of the lay of the land and how countries are responding to this issue
Yeah,
is
for
important.
sure. And the reason that I'm finding this super fascinating is because of the way this is being kind of like dealt with in the media, is that what we're seeing is a ton of vilification
Right.
of workers, students, newcomers, all of that. And then there's not really sort of like direct conversation about bad refugees, but at the same time, I feel like there's like a simmering kind of that there's like this
Mm.
public opinion thing that we've been talking about a lot on the podcast about public opinion has moved away from this welcoming attitude toward immigrants and refugees. And while the predominant dialogue has been like bad students, workers, all of that kind of stuff, there's a similar trending happening in terms of the treatment of refugee claimants in Canada and clearly in the United States as well, that is much less spoken of, but clearly
Mm.
happening on the ground, that I think I want to kind of dive into more as like that's also happening. So while we keep rolling out these programs for like resettling Sudanese and resettling Gazans, those are like virtue signaling programs, but there's no substantive um, thing behind it. And that's just something that I keep seeing over and over again in the way
Mm.
that, like, yes, Canada, great, we love refugees, but the actual thing that we're seeing is not.
Yeah. Just
Mm.
So,
before you do the US, Chris, the Gaza program, and this kind of touches on what Deanna was saying in terms of how governments are positioning themselves. The Gaza resettlement technically isn't a refugee program. They're coming on visitor visas, and the expectation is that they will return to Gaza by the end of the period authorized in
yeah,
Canada.
because that works real
Oh,
well for the Ukrainian
yeah.
program. And,
Yeah.
like, and now there's these people from the CUAET program who are now like, so now what? You want me to go back to what is still a conflict zone? Like, I mean, Canada's thinking about all of this has been a disaster. Same with Sudan, where they
Hmm.
opened up this program, they created it, and from
Yeah.
what the post that was recently put out on LinkedIn, it was a Globe and Mail article that our friend Robert Blanchet put out. This program was rolled out and still no approvals 7 months later. So
Yeah.
again, these are
Sudan
like,
is a permanent program. Ukraine is not. It's also the same thing. They are supposed to go back. So it's this weird, it's not a refugee program, but it was done for humanitarian purposes and it's supposed to be temporary. Anyway, before we get
Yeah.
lost in the weeds, Chris,
yeah.
what's going on in the
And
United States?
well, so on the level of political discourse, I think we're seeing a lot more vilification of asylum seekers as asylum seekers here. I mean, I randomly started looking at old Saturday Night Live videos, and there was a spoof of a right-wing news show about the migrant caravans. Remember those? This was during the Trump administration. I think there was one early in the Biden administration, but large groups like thousands of Central American migrants traveling as a group um, to the southern border. Anyhow, it that really made me remember there was so much negativity about immigrants. Immigrants in general, we've always, the states have always had a very ambivalent attitude about immigration, but
Mm,
since the Trump administration, I'm just sure that asylum seekers have become this sort of reification, this kind of symbolic target, and all of the negatives about immigration are sort of put on them.
I see.
And and I think honestly, they don't have a constituency. I mean, who cares about asylum seekers? Nerds like us do, but but politically, they don't. Who's going to stand up and advocate for immigrants against that? I don't know. There's no realistic pushback, and so I think it's been a very easy way for anti-immigrant politicians to
Mm.
whip up a lot of fear. I mean, the stuff, and again, I don't know how much news filters to Canada about this, but the whole eating pets thing.
Oh,
Ever
I was
hear
going to
about
make a comment about that, but was waiting
right?
for
Yeah.
the
Oh
moment to dive
God.
in saying, isn't
Right,
part of the concern that they eat cats and dogs?
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
But
no,
just so
that's
long as
getting a
they,
lot of airtime up here, I gotta say.
it's completely unhinged. But I think, and these are Haitians, which Haitians, a lot of Haitians are asylum seekers. Most of these folks are probably on temporary protected status. Um, Nobody cares about the fine distinction, right? I mean, I don't think that's, in terms of public discourse, even pretty educated people aren't really up on on the the fine distinctions between the statuses and the categories that we of
What
course
is
live in.
I mean, I don't think most of our listeners will know what that distinction is. What is
So
the difference
temporary
between an
protected
asylum
status,
and a protected status?
yeah, so temporary protected status, it's a statutory mechanism where the government can designate a country because of civil strife, natural disasters, things like that. And it's a decision that because of the conditions in the country, they're not going to remove people to that country. And so then
Hmm.
they give them a temporary protected status, typically in 18-month increments. So it's extended periodically.
Hmm.
And so it's a temporary status. It's, the T is for temporary. It's never going to become, there's no path to permanent status. TPSs are somewhat political. There's been a Venezuelan TPS for the last well, how long has it been? Maybe 2.5 years. It overlaps with asylum a lot. I mean, I work with a lot of Venezuelan clients. Probably half of my clients are Venezuelans and asylum seekers predominantly. And a lot of those folks are registering for TPS because they feel like it gives them some extra protection.
Hmm.
Um, so that's TPS. It's
When you say that
temporary.
there's no pathway to permanency, like you can't then make an asylum claim
Oh,
or
sure, sure, sure. Yeah,
okay,
you can. I mean, by itself, it's no pen, but you're free to make an asylum
right.
claim. You're free to get married. You're free to get a high skills job. And there's typically a lot of overlap between folks from TPS designated countries and asylum seekers. I mean, Venezuela is a perfect example. Um,
You can only
there's
get a high skills job or you can get a job.
no for employment-based immigration in the States. That's not really.
No, on TPS.
Oh, on TPS, you can get no, you're work authorized. So
Okay.
but like in the potential ways that you might
I
get
see.
out of,
Okay.
TPS is a cul-de-sac. It's
Okay,
not
I
going
see.
anywhere by itself, but it doesn't foreclose other ways like asylum, family or marriage-based
Yeah.
immigration. It doesn't foreclose those other options.
Okay.
Where are most asylum claims? So how many are there in the US? Like what's the backlog right now?
Oh, it's about somewhere between 1,300,000 and 1,400,000 asylum cases with the USCIS Asylum Office. So, I mean, we talk about asylum in two different fora. There's, with USCIS, USCIS is the immigration agency. So these are people who get here and they apply for asylum on their own initiative. In other words, they're not facing removal. It's an affirmative benefit that they're seeking. So that backlog is about a million, somewhere between 1,300,000 and 1,400,000 claims pending. At the end of the year, at the end of 2023, it was a million. So it's, in the space of a year, it's gone up by 30, 40%. So
Well,
it's exploding.
And are they,
We're
when people say that there's up to 20 million undocumented people in the United States, are they part of that figure or?
I'd be really skeptical of any of those numbers. I mean, some of the more reliable numbers about the undocumented population, for example, the Migration Policy Institute is a reliable source. Their numbers, I haven't looked at them lately, but I think is about 12 million people. But
Okay, so
again,
is
it's a
that
pop.
on and 12 plus one, or are they not? Are the asylum seekers that million part of that or in addition to?
I mean, technically, they wouldn't be counted in the undocumented population because when a person makes an asylum claim, they're legally authorized to stay in the United States.
mm.
They don't have any kind of, it's weird because it's not a status as such, but they're authorized to remain for the time that that claim is pending. And
And
they're
I don't
usually
know if
given work
you're,
authorization.
sorry, Chris. I don't know if you're aware of this, but like, is this strictly the number of asylum claims, like inland asylum claims that are actually being dealt with? But in addition to that, are there also overseas resettlement that the US deals with, or is that not
Yes.
really a thing? There is.
No, no,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is
I
so,
don't
yeah,
know.
this 1,000,003 number that I'm giving, 1,300,000 number is right. People who are in the United States working their claims here. Refugee resettlement is still happening. I don't know what the numbers are for this
Yeah.
fiscal year. It's smaller than that, substantially smaller than that. There are a lot
Hmm.
of one-off programs that are making it hard. I don't pay attention to those numbers that closely, the refugee numbers, but yes, it's a whole separate program, happens
Yeah.
overseas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I mean in Canada prior to COVID, it was like right at the start of COVID, the volume of pending refugee claims in Canada was 85,000, and at the start of August of this year, it was 186,000 cases, which, if you take the
wow.
United States as 10 times the population, although I hear Canada is catching up and it may be now a factor of nine, per capita, our backlog currently is comparable, if not bigger, than what it
Interesting.
is in the United States. We, though, have a much smaller undocumented population. Now, no one, of course,
Mm,
knows, as in the United States, what it is, but the figures that you see bandied around range from 20,000 to 500,000.
mm,
Of course, Canada also doesn't have a situation similar to the southern border that the United States has. In theory, we
right.
have a very long undefended border with our southern neighbors. There just aren't as many people coming up. And as Deanna mentioned at the outset, there's an agreement to prevent asylum claims from people who are in the United States.
Right, right.
Hmm.
One
Hmm.
other thing on the backlog is there are tremendous numbers of people who are working their asylum claims in the context of removal proceedings. And let me see if I was able to. It's hard to find good numbers.
Yeah.
That's about 1,500,000, over maybe more like 1,600,000 asylum claims pending with the immigration court system. Um,
Can you
and those
just
are mutually
explain the difference
exclusive.
between defensive and affirmative asylum claims, though? I'm
Sure.
confused by this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So affirmative is you're physically present in the US. Mostly it doesn't matter how you get here, whether although there's some important things to mention about that coming up. So yeah, you're physically present in the U.S. You send in an application to the Immigration Service, the USCIS. Um, that's an affirmative application. You make it on your own initiative. You're seeking a government benefit. Um, Defensive is when, for whatever reason, the government is trying to deport you. The government is forcing your removal from the United States, and your asylum application is a defense. It's like you can't, don't deport me. I'm facing persecution if you send me
Right.
back. So
Okay.
defensive. The um, defensive applications happen in an administrative court forum. So it's immigration court. It's a adversarial hearing. There's a government prosecutor essentially who's working against your case. There's an administrative law judge, an immigration judge who's adjudicating the case. Legal standards are identical. Um,
Huh.
so that's defensive.
Okay.
Um,
That's all very different from what we have. There's like, it doesn't, like, if I mean, I guess I think that the defensive asylum applications maps on most closely to what we call a pre-removal risk assessment,
mhm.
but it's not the same as an asylum claim.
Hmm.
Although
And
our
it's
asylum claims start with a removal order.
yes, which is bizarre.
They do?
It's
Oh.
freaking
So
bizarre.
yeah, as soon as you declare asylum in Canada, you get issued a departure order. It closes off pretty much all other immigration options. If your
Huh.
refugee claim is rejected, there's caveats to this, but the idea is that you have 30 days to leave the country, or your departure order will become what's called the deportation order, and you'll be banned from Canada for life. There's all sorts of caveats and
Yes.
exceptions to this, but that's the general process.
That was a very
Wow.
concise summary. Yeah. So but like,
Interesting.
well, oh, you want to claim asylum? Okay, here's your removal order. Um, but anyways, a pre-removal risk assessment, if you've already had a removal order issued against you for any reason, at that point you can no longer seek asylum in Canada. So you
Oh,
can't do it in a
really?
yeah, it's bizarre.
Huh.
But you may be eligible for what's called a pre-removal risk assessment, which is something much lesser than a refugee claim. It is not in front of an administrative tribunal. Most often it's decided on paper after very long delays with very,
Huh.
very low procedural fairness. And anyways, I won't get
Oh.
into but it's very different. Um, and so it's funny how in the US system, it's kind of flipped, that it's a more adversarial, robust process with a defensive
Hmm.
claim, whereas we've got it flipped here. And whether or not the minister intervenes is only based on whether or not on the particular facts of the case there are credibility issues or they want to oppose for some reason. On a regular refugee
Right.
claim, they usually don't intervene unless it's like we have some reason to doubt. But
But
yeah,
so a regular refugee claim, there is a potential for an adversarial. The government can oppose it.
yeah, they're happening more and more often, actually. And that's actually one of the issues we're facing, where sometimes the foreign criminal charge that is the reason you fled and are now seeking asylum becomes the
Hmm.
reason that the minister is intervening because they think you're a serious criminal.
Right.
So it's like
Right.
you've
Right. Right.
been, you've been like the criminal charge by that potentially despotic government will be a reason why
Yeah.
you now face an adversarial system. That is something that I am seeing with more and more frequency.
Interesting. And of course, we know pretextual prosecution is it's a pretty leading form of persecution in a
Exactly.
lot of contexts.
Yes.
So,
So like Uganda has said that we think you're inadmissible for that you should be charged with treason for supporting the wrong side. That now becomes a potential reason why you face an adversarial rather than a conciliatory process at the IRB. Like it's
yeah,
mind-numbing. Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty bonkers. I mean, I'm just, to use a term of art.
Yeah. No,
No,
for
I'm just
sure.
thinking about a lot of the folks that I deal, the Venezuelans that I work with, and a lot of Nicaraguans. There's such a systematic misuse of judicial process against political opponents in those countries. I mean, most of my clients are Latin Americans. And but yeah, those two countries in particular account
Yeah.
for, when Cuba actually, if you take Cubans, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, that's probably getting into maybe 60 or 70% of asylum seekers in the last couple of years in the States.
What
And
about
yeah,
Mexicans?
um, pretty high numbers, extremely low success rates. Mexican asylum claims are almost always hopeless. You get a few here and there that are merit, I mean, asylum claims are limited to making out a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of the protected grounds, right? Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a social group. So with Mexican claims, what you see are just, vast numbers of gang recruitment, uh, you know, claims that are based on the really, really gnarly and unacceptable security situation in Mexico, but that really are hard to connect to a protected group.
Yeah.
That's the trouble.
Yeah.
I,
I've done some here in Canada that have been successful, but they're hard.
yeah.
Um, it's sort of like situations, the cases that I've dealt with, it's like family members have already been killed by cartel, and there's
Oh,
some actual evidence that they are findable everywhere at any time and that there would be some motivation. But like the evidentiary
oh,
burden is
that
overwhelming.
wouldn't that wouldn't even get you close in our
Really?
system. That would not even get you close because that's everybody. I mean, there's with Mexican claims, really
Yeah.
almost any Latin American claim at this point, there's such a floodgates fear. And with that, that factual situation that you describe is so common. But it's,
But I think
you
that
know,
that sort of goes back to what we started out with, this sort of the the discourse around vilification of refugees, because in
yeah.
Canada, the one group that has been vilified is the Mexican claimants, where this is bogus
Really.
claims,
Hmm.
bogus claims. I think that we haven't, the Canadian public has had a distaste for the idea of using that rhetoric around non-Mexican claimants. But I
Hmm.
think with Mexico, that stuff has been like, even the previous ministers have called them bogus claims, even though we see
Yeah.
those
Right.
routinely where like you're calling this bogus, like maybe it won't succeed, but bogus, like what?
Right. Right.
Like,
Like arguable, maybe, but bogus, no. Right.
yeah, definitely not bogus. Whether or not it's going to meet this like incredibly high threshold is something different, but like
Hmm.
the idea
Hmm.
that these are liars is like,
Right. Yeah,
And
right,
so one
right.
of the measures that they took to try to dissuade and reduce the number of claims was to impose a visa requirement. I just pulled up the
Hmm.
stats from the Immigration Refugee Board, which actually has a higher number of claims pending than what the media reported, which is 218,000, 500,000 claims pending, of which Mexico is the highest number of country of people pending. So again, I've mentioned that they slammed a
Hmm.
visa requirement on it, followed
Hmm.
by India, which I would say has actually become more controversial than Mexicans, at least in the public
yes,
discourse
Hmm.
in
I agree.
Canada,
Yeah.
followed
Yeah,
by like
certainly what I hear about
Nigeria,
down
Haiti.
here is that.
Yeah.
And then in Nigeria, like the Canadian government actually, most of the Nigerian claims were from people who were coming through the United States, which was part of the whole Roxham Road Safe Third Party. And Canada actually
Hmm.
asked the United States to stop issuing so many visas to Nigerians because they were coming up. Are there similar, like, what measures does the United States take to try to reduce claims? So in Canada, it's, imposing visa requirements. Arguably, a lot of I would say that there's at least a partial motivation for the reduction in international student numbers in
Hmm.
Canada and a focus on bogus schools, quote unquote,
Hmm.
is that certain schools have almost no one studying and high asylum claims. I've heard in the United States that there's this remain in Mexico policy. I don't know if that still
Hmm.
exists or if it came and went or if it came and went and is back. Can you touch on how that works? Because as a Canadian, the
Yeah.
idea of like remain in the country that you're fleeing from is a bit of an odd concept in refugee law. second only to fly them from London to Rwanda, which I know was discontinued when the Brits tried that.
But it's not
Right,
remain in the country where you're fleeing from, because then you can't make a claim. You have to be
Right. It's
outside of your country of
yeah,
persecution, but also not able
I
to
guess
get to
remaining
Canada.
in the country that
right,
you're
right,
not fleeing from, but not stopping your fleeing in,
right,
that being
Yeah.
Mexico.
So you need
right.
to
Well,
basically have an interim place of asylum before you can get to the eventual place of, and that interim
right.
place is invariably, it must be hostile to you. Otherwise, they will conclude that you could just settle there.
Yeah,
Well, this is all
right,
Mexico. This is
right.
the remain in Mexico policy.
Yeah, I mean this. So the answer to your to all there's sort of an overall answer to those questions, which is okay. So what is the U.S. doing to forestall asylum claims? Right in the last year and a half, there have been two measures that are just appalling, in my opinion. So the
Okay.
first is the circumventing legal pathways rule,
Mm-hmm.
and this was something that was timed to tightly coincide with the ending of health-related border closures. So all during COVID, the border was functionally closed, and people who were apprehended were just sent back. There was no opportunity to apply for asylum. There was, not even a formal removal or expedited removal process. They were just kicked back. So border effectively closed in COVID. And then, politically, the government knew that when those were set to expire, there was this fear of a great big stampede. So the Biden administration's answer to that was this circumventing legal pathways rule, which kind of makes sense from a policy nerd point of view. It has some practical issues. And so the policy nerd is okay, we're gonna open up legal pathways for people to come to the US to seek asylum. So those are number one, different nationality based parole programs. So at the beginning when we were talking, you mentioned Ukrainians. So there's been a Ukrainian parole program almost since the conflict there started. Um, there's a parole program for Canadians, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Um, and so these parole programs let people be sponsored by an individual in the United States, and then you have to come on a plane. So that means you have to have a passport, which means you have to have, right. So there's a class filter happening there, right? It
Yeah,
isn't just
yeah.
anybody. Um, and parole is a conditional entrance. Parole is basically, okay, you're allowed to physically enter the country while your legal status is being resolved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so these parole programs, and I think the numbers on those are pretty high. Maybe 500,000 people have come on those since they started. Um, and the vast, vast majority of those folks are going to seek asylum. Some of them might have family-based options, but really, in practice, those are asylum seekers. So partly, well, why do you think we have such an asylum backlog? I mean, this is a little bit what the right wing is saying, like, oh, you're letting all these people in and they're just going to seek asylum, which it's like, well, what's wrong with that? Exactly. But it has contributed to backlog. So anyhow, so there's these parole programs, and then there's the CBP1 app on your phone. I don't know if you've heard about that, but so again, during COVID, actually pre-COVID, um, at the southern border, they started all these metering programs, which essentially were asylum seekers who presented at a port of entry, who walked up to a border crossing point to seek asylum, were told, no, the border's full, we can't take you. And, they, um, we ready for a little story, a little
Mm-hmm.
anecdote?
What do you mean the
So,
border's full? Can you just explain what that means? Like,
right. So in international law terms and even in domestic law terms, makes no sense. And there was a
okay,
lot of litigation around this practice of metering, of not letting people in.
okay,
Um, Because, right, theoretically, people are supposed to be able to show up at the border and seek asylum, right?
right.
That's
That's the
both an
principle
international,
of non-refoulement or whatever. It's like
exactly, right.
you
Well
sign the
established,
convention, right?
yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's been well established in U.S. law too. But during the Trump administration, it's like, oh no, the border's closed. So then people were forced to stay. Now, this isn't the formal Remain in Mexico program. Basically, this is like people would literally. So I worked with some indigenous Mexican people from the Triqui ethnic group in Oaxaca. I've kind of got a connection with that community. So they were Mexican nationals, but they, came up to the border. I went down to Tijuana to walk them in. And of course, the Border Patrol guys like sealed off the, the entrance and said, no, the border's closed. You have to go sign up on this list. So there was this NGO that was maintaining this list. And so we like walked around in Tijuana for about 2 hours. We finally found this place where the list was this like coffee stained, beat up, spiral bound notebook with people's names and cell phone numbers written down in pen. And this is how the border, so then basically you just hang out until your number comes up. And it was months. This family that I worked with, they waited 2 years in Tijuana. They were internally displaced for 2 years. Um, so there were all these
Sorry,
metering
they were
programs.
Mexicans, those people who were waiting
They
in
were
Tijuana. Yeah.
Mexicans. Yeah, they were Mexicans, right? But, there were tens and tens of thousands of migrants waiting in border regions to be able to present themselves at the border to seek asylum.
Yeah.
Um, so what Biden did, that was during the Trump administration. What Biden did was set up this to partly deal with that situation of the border being closed, was set up the CBP One app. So it's this app that you can download on your phone, and you have to be in northern Mexico to use it, and you can make an appointment to show up at the border to seek asylum. And you gotta wonder how that's working out, right?
Well, I
So,
know how it's working out because I tried to make an appointment for a Nexus interview and I know how well that worked. And
Well,
I'm not in
Nexus,
danger of any sort.
oh my God, and Nexus is like NASA technology compared to
Oh
CBP
my
One. I mean,
God.
it's this notoriously glitchy, hard to use app. It's available in maybe 8 languages, but definitely doesn't meet the linguistic breadth of
did they say
refugees.
that it would cost $80,000 and then it turned out to cost 50 million?
I didn't hear that.
That's a Canada.
Yeah.
Canada has a similar app that was supposed to cost
Oh,
80
Uh,
yeah,
and
yeah.
50 million.
Yeah, that got ended up getting
Um,
thrown out. But I
right.
also have clients who like I do know because I hear some from many, many clients who have fled like atrocity truly from all across Africa and various places in the Middle East walking up through Central and South America
Oh
make it
yeah.
there. It's not like they have their cell phones. If they were not stolen in the Panamanian desert, then it's like a freaking miracle
Right.
because that's part of the
Right.
path, right? It's not like
Right.
they're whipping out
Exactly.
their phone to book their appointment. So,
Right, exactly. And guess what?
so
It's about a 6 month wait for an appointment. Even if you get through all these other highly improbable, you know, roadblocks, it's then you're going to wait 6 months. So then, and I'm really going to answer your question, Stephen. So basically, the Biden's program is if you don't come through one of these legal pathways, which are problematic in themselves, if you don't come through one of these legal pathways, then you're not eligible for asylum. So if you just, if you somehow make it to the border and cross in an unauthorized way, um, you are in the United States, you can present an asylum claim, but your eligibility is essentially cut off. There are some exceptions, but they're ludicrously hard to make
mm,
out. So that circumventing legal pathways rule is hugely problematic, and
mhm.
it's essentially a third country travel ban, which we had Remain in Mexico. I don't want to forget that loop. Remain in Mexico was essentially a third country travel ban. So if you passed through a third country on the way to the US and you didn't present an asylum claim there, you were barred from asylum here.
Oh,
Yeah, so Trump had that kind of written on the
oh,
back of a napkin. The
and did
Biden administration
Mexico, this
now
sort
has
of
it.
like what, like that was going to be my sort of question is what, once you're sitting in Mexico and it's taking 2 years, what are people filing claims in Mexico then? Like, what's the,
Very small numbers, very small numbers. The last numbers I saw, which is it's been probably 6 to 9 months since I looked at those numbers. It wasn't a six-figure number. it was under 100,000 people who were filing asylum claims in Mexico.
Yeah.
And I mean, the refugee flows going through Mexico are astonishing. You know, the numbers of people that are on the move, like you say, coming up through Panama, and literally like walking or taking buses through all of Central America and Mexico are hundreds of thousands. So yeah, it's a pretty
Wow.
yeah,
Has
the
there
number
been
of people.
talk of like not ignoring whether it would be desirable or not, but like has the United States tried to implement the safe third party agreement with Mexico as well?
Not quite. But so during the Trump years, there were some can't they call them something, but they were on the same statutory authority as the
Mm.
Safe Third Country Agreement with Canada, and I think with Guatemala and El Salvador. And they did, the implementation was pretty spotty, but they did start implementing them in the Trump administration before COVID. And so it was pretty crazy because people would be apprehended and they would be put on a plane and maybe you're Guatemala. You're put on, or maybe you're from Kenya or from Sudan or Ethiopia. You're apprehended in either by Mexican immigration or US immigration, and then you're on a plane and you're kicked out of the plane in a country that they haven't even told you where it is. Right. So I mean I talked to Guatemalan people who ended up in El Salvador. They didn't know where they were until they were like out of the airport and like on the streets
Hmm.
asking people like, where are we?
Holy shit.
So that and yeah, right, exactly, right. I mean, that was the Trump years, and that didn't get major traction in terms of numbers, and Biden hasn't attempted to resuscitate that. Um, the Biden administration, I mean, every administration's plan, but Biden's been pretty effective at it, and actually, there's been close cooperation with AMLO's government in Mexico. There's a lot of money and resources going into enforcement in Mexico. So that's part, and a lot of that money's
So
coming
when you
from the
say
U.S.
that, would that be on like the Mexico-Belize Guatemala
Mexico-Guatemala
border?
border primarily,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. Although internal too. And I mean, boy, oh boy, if you think the cartels are bad, look out for Mexican immigration. I've heard some absolutely tooth-curling stories about Mexican immigration authorities.
Mm.
Um,
Well, this sort of takes us back to our conversation with Petra Molnar, and like if it's not the immigration authorities, it's the like robo dogs or whatever else they have patrolling the desert region between the two countries,
yeah,
so yeah, that
yeah,
deployment is really significant.
significant. Yeah. Remain in Mexico was right. It wasn't actually for Mexican people. It was for third country nationals. And I represented a few people where I went down to San Diego. That was a crazy system because, yeah, again, people had to wait months or years for a final hearing. They were stuck in these really dangerous border towns. The families I worked with in that were Mexican, or no, I'm sorry, not Mexican, Venezuelan. And they had a little bit better situation because they had relatives with some resources, so they could, rent an apartment. But
Yeah.
still, tremendously vulnerable. That Biden stopped that when he first took office, and then there's litigation that's reinstated it, but it's not being used. I don't think it's being used in a major way right now.
I see.
Yeah.
So it,
Well, to
it is
what
exactly what.
extent
Mhm.
are US, because the other, I mean, part of why the refugee numbers are dominating Canadian media to some extent lately is because it's putting a strain on resources. Like I think I saw a stat that
Mhm.
25% of people on social assistance in Ontario are asylum claimants. I've seen in the United States, it's hard to really tell what's going on, but like you hear, setting aside pets, that like New York is saying, or New York City's mayor was saying they're overwhelmed, but it seems much more. It's just hard to get a sense of like, is it certain areas in the United States feel overwhelmed, at least at the political level? Because the thing that you have in the United States is like some states busing migrants to other
Hmm.
states. The
Yeah.
federal
Yeah.
government in Canada, like the discourse is a little bit different because it's not provinces threatening to send asylum claimants from one place to another, but the federal government has been proposing
Hmm.
relocating asylum seekers to from
Yeah.
Ontario and Quebec to other provinces, and
Huh.
That's
those
going down
premiers are
real
saying
well.
it's going down really, really as you'd expect.
Oh my God.
Um,
Right. And guess
so,
it'll
but
probably
does
be
that
like
happen
send
at
them
the
to
federal
Calgary or
level
something,
in the
right?
United States? Because from what I can tell, in Canada, the federal government's trying to organize it. I don't get the sense that it's the same in the United States. Rather, it's just
Mm-mm.
individual states
It's
moving people
Texas.
around.
It's
Yeah.
I as far as
But then
that's a
Texas, I saw like New York was actually driving migrants to the Canadian border at one point.
I read that too. I'm not sure how anecdotal that was, but I did see something like that go by.
So like how
Um,
strained are things and like is it concentrated in certain areas?
I
Is it
think it is.
media overblowing it? Like
That's
what is
also a
going
yes.
on?
I think both of those. I mean,
I see.
it's it's I mean the busing of migrants has mostly happened from Texas. It's mostly a political stunt by the governor and government of Texas to discredit. I mean, number one, discredit the asylum system. Number two, discredit immigration in general. And number three, to really stick it to democratically controlled jurisdictions like New York and Chicago.
Mm,
Because, yeah, they're dumping, I mean, effectively dumping, thousands and thousands of people on these cities that already have plenty to deal with. And
mm.
it's not, I don't think it's more widespread than that. I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
concentrated in a handful of cities. And
I'm
it's,
hearing about people being sent from San Diego to New York.
yeah.
That's one that I've
Hmm.
heard a number of times where they just didn't know what was going on and then they got shipped to New
Yeah.
York. So,
I heard some of that too from San Diego. I'm not sure how significant that is. I only
okay.
read one article about that. Um,
We'll see what happens
you
in
know,
Canada. I have no idea. Like so far it seems like everyone's just, chattering at each other. I've
right?
seen some
Chattering, I
posts
think it's
where
more like shouting.
shouting at each other, tweeting
Idiots.
angrily
Yeah.
at each other,
Yeah.
posting these are the sanctuary cities. If they want to be sanctuary cities, shouldn't they have to take them?
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, here
which
it's not,
I
there's
like
no
the guys.
government involvement. So, and how strained are the resources? I mean, I think, yeah, from what I read, like Chicago, New York, yeah, it's gotten pretty serious. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
That sort of
yeah.
like you've explained very beautifully, like what are some of the key barriers to getting in, getting the claim in
Hmm.
process, all of that. What would you say are the key barriers once the claim is in process and the adjudicative function?
Mm, interesting. Um, I mean, number one, just there's a fairly strict, restrictive interpretation of the five protected grounds, especially in terms of social group. I mean, the jurisprudence around particular social group claims in the US has just tacked all over the map. And so it's really hard to keep track of. But the social group claims, those are the ones typically where you get gang recruitment or cartel violence, gender-based violence. All those are going to fall on that particular social group claim. And different Board of Immigration Appeals and to some extent appellate level decision making has really narrowed the applicability of that ground. So that's a big barrier. I mean, that's a filter right there that's going to take out the vast majority of your Mexican asylum claims,
Yeah.
most of your Central American asylum claims.
Yeah. I have to
Anytime we're
say, like, I don't do a lot of that work, but I think it's very similar here that they don't consider that to be membership.
right,
I think
right.
unless there's also a like gender-based violence kind of component to it, you're gonna
Hmm.
have a really hard time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's that. There, I mean, this is a little obscure and probably not something we want to delve into a whole lot, but people who are encountered at the southern border are run through this credible fear screening, which is sort of a preliminary assessment of your asylum claim. It typically happens when people are in detention. And the standards for passing a credible fear interview to be released into the U.S. to present your claim in immigration court, have they keep sort of notching them up. So that's a filter that's being applied. Um, the other thing, there are the jurisprudence around criminal eligibility hasn't been great. That's not something that I deal with a lot in my cases, but that's definitely something where there are filters being applied. Um, in the context of immigration court, which about half my asylum work is in immigration court, this contested administrative tribunal. Um, Credibility, and this is somewhat reflected on a decisional level of published cases, but it's definitely reflected in how adjudicators approach this. Credibility is getting tighter and tighter,
Oh,
where
yeah.
the most obscure, well, I just think standards for credibility are being applied in completely unrealistic and unreasonable ways.
Hmm.
And the great thing about credibility from an adjudicator standpoint is it's almost appeal proof,
Oh, yeah. It's like
right?
a carte blanche. This is actually an
Mhm.
area of great fascination for me. And I know that like but I would say in Canada, there has been great progress in terms of an understanding of trauma-based adjudication. And that doesn't mean
Wow.
that it's perfect,
Hmm.
but there has been some infiltration of science into the adjudicative process where people
Awesome.
realize that being able to tell an unflawed, perfect chronology is not
Right.
consistent with persons who have suffered severe
Right.
post-traumatic stress,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
Hmm.
I think that is the one thing that I would say we are doing. Like, I don't think, I think that we're moving at least in the right direction with that, and that we've had some good decisions I mean, I'm seeing some good progress in that in my own
Wow.
hearings. So the fact that it's going in the opposite, and again, I'm nervous about it because it's very new and I feel like it's fleeting.
Hmm.
So I'm,
Hmm.
with this climate shift, I'm worried that that too will get clawed back. It used to be that certain types of claims, you could just put the information on paper with the proper reports and be like, look, this is not an appropriate case to put this person into a hearing, and they could decide it on
Right.
paper. That
Uh,
process was fantastic for people who were like
right.
newly arrived, severely traumatized,
Yeah.
unable to like,
Yeah. Hmm.
but I feel like it's been clawed back a whole bunch already. And
Mm.
now those people are being subjected to, I mean, not subjected to, I don't want to say that like there shouldn't be a screenings process. Of course there should
Right.
be, but it's just, I feel like it was a step back.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd
Hmm.
say I've been practicing almost 20 years. We've come a long way in that department of trauma informed, at least in Portland. The adjudicators that I deal with in Portland are way better than they used to be. But it's still pretty bad. I mean, there's
Yeah.
still, and I think the expectation is increasing that a person has to be able to sit down, and articulate a super linear, super fact-based, almost, technical writing type of story, or if not, they're going to be denied. So I mean, all the cross-cultural differences, all the impact of trauma,
Yeah.
just, it's so unrealistic and
Yeah. It's not supported by neuroscience, and that's the thing that
not
I
at
feel like
all.
not at all. And I think that some of that finally started to get through, and now I just fear that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
receding.
Yeah.
Hmm. I
I
mean,
have to
luckily,
run in a bit.
Yeah.
I've made Deanna the host. I do have a, I mean, if you two can definitely continue the convo, I do have a final question, which would be if you had to
hmm?
predict 3 years from now, what's going on in the U.S. asylum system,
Oh
midway through
boy.
the next administration, what is the backlog growing? Is it shrinking?
Oh boy.
What's going on? Are people still eating pets? Are people locking up their pets?
Yeah, I'm not letting my turtle out at night anymore, that's for sure. I we
Turtle. Oh,
we
that's
haven't heard about.
adorable.
I do have, yep, true fact. I do have a pet turtle,
Yeah.
and who's 50 years old. Um,
No.
Isn't that like
Yeah,
midlife
Is
for a
that for
turtle?
real?
that's
Oh
for
my God,
real.
that's so cool. How long have you
I
had your turtle?
Well, since 1976 when Gerald Ford was president. Or wait,
Oh
no,
my God.
1975, 1975.
Oh my God. That's really cool. I love that.
Right. So anyhow, I'm not worried about Freddie, and our cat isn't our cat, so we're good on that. I mean, I think there are two possible scenarios. Number one is I mean, I think I'm paranoid, but bear me out. Hear me out. I think if we get a Trump administration and we get a Republican Congress, I don't think it's out of the question that the Refugee Act would be repealed. And
Yeah. No, I mean, I've been
I,
worrying that too.
I haven't heard anybody saying that. I mean, I think that's not going to rile people up on social media enough, but I definitely
No.
think it would happen.
I know. And people are calling me alarmist, but I do worry about people just fundamentally rethinking the refugee convention. And I think that that's
Absolutely.
why I keep
Hmm.
going crazy about these notions of sovereignty and, what does nationhood mean and all this kind of stuff. Because I think it's kind of
Yeah.
like, I get that shit is difficult over there, but we
Hmm.
just simply don't want that. We want the top of the top and not the ones that are like this sort of notion that these people
Yeah.
drain and those people elevate, like this
Right.
weird
Yeah.
paradigm. It's not how I see at
Right.
all
Of course. Right.
the world or my country, but at the same time, I do feel like there is that this is what comes from human capital model immigration style, and I
Hmm.
think I
Hmm.
feel that it is a slippery slope.
I think it's
That's
And
weird that,
again,
like, I
interesting.
mean, regardless of whether I agree or disagree on how the asylum system should function or not, this is what I asked Petra. Like, I do think it's weird that it's not something that gets raised, considering how much money countries seem to spend trying to avoid, like,
yeah,
actually having people make it to claim asylum. Like,
Right.
I think it's
yeah,
weird that I've been surprised that
yeah,
politicians aren't openly saying it, considering
yeah,
how much money gets
Right.
spent to avoid people showing up.
for
So that's
sure.
your that's the first thing you
So that
said.
Yeah, that's the first
There
thing.
won't be an
And I mean,
asylum system.
if we if we get a Democratic administration, I think what we'll see is essentially more of the same. I mean, the things that Harris as a candidate right now is promoting for border enforcement was something that the Republicans were trying to force down, were trying to force through the Congress in February, I think, earlier this year. And Chuck Schumer did this great pivot where they sort of, the Democrats sort of said, "Okay, sure," and then Trump said, "No, you can't do it." But it was a very restrictive, very harsh Republican um, suite of border control measures. And
A little bit more about what that means, like just like in a nutshell, what the tenor.
oh, it was, much essentially removing any kind of rights to due process, really practically militarizing the border in terms of enforcement, in terms of the kind of resources and strategy. As
They're going to
far,
build a wall. I thought there was like the Democrats were going to finish the wall and make
yeah, there was some of that.
Montana pay for it or whatever.
There was some of that. But I mean,
Okay.
I guess so. My point is, even with an ostensibly friendly Democratic administration, the point of departure is something that was a fairly right-wing restrictionist Republican policy proposal 6 months ago.
Right.
That's how far the debate has moved.
Right. 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 Yeah. I mean,
So,
that's the
Do you think
thing when
that's a
we're
move
talking
because
about
of the
this.
election and that if they win, it'll revert to what it was at the start of the Biden administration, or who knows?
I
No?
mean, Biden, I think Biden started out with some pretty positive moves about immigration overall, and politically had to backtrack and move far to the restrictionist positions. I mean, the circumventing legal pathways rule that I mentioned. The other sort of severely restrictive thing is this interim final rule which functionally closing off the border if encounters reach a certain number. Um, these are all things that Republicans dream about at night. that the Democratic administration has sort of felt politically obliged to implement.
I think that
Yeah.
for me, I keep saying to people that feel like we're like I feel like we're reading the chapter in the history book um right before the part where it says this is how World War III began. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh,
Like I
Deanna
feel
took
like
your negativity, Chris, and
I,
ooh,
I
ouch, doubled it.
I'm gonna do it. I feel like I feel like the thing is that what's moved the needle is just that everybody is making fear-based decisions right now. This is always what
Yeah.
happens when global conflict rises to a level. Everyone
Yeah.
starts buttoning down the hatches and closing the doors. And so it's not about
Yeah.
one particular candidate, and so I just feel like that's where
No,
we
no, no,
are
absolutely
right
not.
now. And so,
Right.
Okay, I gotta run, but
Yeah.
look
yeah,
forward to hearing the when I
the
listen to this
conclusion.
before it goes up, the doomsday. We're all gonna die if you're selling, recommending, what are they called? The survivalist, the people
Yeah.
who like go out on their own into the wilderness spots to batten down the hatches. All
Yeah.
right,
Right.
take care, guys.
Yeah.
All
Bye.
right. Thank you.
And I'm really not saying it to be alarmist. I mean, I am a little bit, I guess, but
Hmm.
clearly, but I think that at the same time, it's I do find myself being like, hey, are we noticing this? But also
Right.
I'm sort of nervous because I'm not sure that this is the right time to be like, hey, how do we feel about refugees?
Hmm.
How do we feel about providing asylum? Because the national, the global temperament towards providing protection is not good right now in
It's so
general.
negative. Right.
It's so negative. And I think that that always happens. That is like
Yeah.
the story of World War II, like,
Right.
no, no,
Yeah.
no, keep it over there,
Right.
And then
Right.
afterwards, there's all this like, oh, shoot, I'm so sorry. We should have done that differently. Right?
Well, and I think, that I don't know where this idea goes, but I think about this a lot, that the paradigm of refugee law and the paradigm of dealing with global displacement that came up out of World War II, like you're saying, it just doesn't work anymore for the kind of migration flows that we have now, the causes of them, the sort of breakdown of the rule of law, climate change, all these drivers of migration now are so mismatched with our refugee protection system. There's
Yes.
categories of the five protected grounds. I I don't want to just get rid of all those, but I
No.
do think that there's a way that we have to really kind of fundamentally rethink them
Yeah.
to account for the world we live in today, which is so different than the post-World War II era. I don't know
But
what that looks like, but
I
but
don't
I'm
know
curious
either.
to hear what you think.
Well, I mean, I can just tell you this anecdote keeps coming back to me because when I was in my final year of law school, I studied in Holland. And law school for me in Canada was a shit show. I hated it. I like almost
Mm.
dropped out numerous times. But when I went to Holland, it was like this is what we're supposed to be doing here, right?
Huh.
So I remember we were talking about these types of issues. And what they did in the first day of one of our courses is they took us to a concentration camp on the French German border. And they were like, okay, so now, based on how you feel, having done that thing, now remember that the international courts of justice were created to not have this happen again.
Wow.
So now let's go meet the people at the international courts of justice. And so we went there and we
Wow.
interacted with the judges. And this was at the time of the War Crimes Tribunal, and Slobodan Milosevic was in hearings, and it's sort of like,
Yeah. 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 Wow.
okay, okay. And so, like, that's
This
the kind
has
of
meaning.
moment that I'm on, where it's like,
Hmm.
okay, like, I'm not talking about like, should we have this, whatever those initials are that represent that policy that you're talking about now? Like, not this, not about is it an app or not an app and numbers backlog versus
Yeah.
that, but like, whoa,
Right.
whoa, whoa, hold on a second.
Right. Let's
We are
reset.
in this situation where there are genocides happening here
Yes.
and there and there and there and there. I can name 10
Uh-huh.
right now.
Yeah. Right.
What are we doing to stop and
Right.
to absorb and to be humane and to like,
Right.
because right now it's like I don't know what we're doing.
Yeah.
so So that's it's not doomsday actually at all. I'm very optimistic. I don't feel like
Yeah,
what we're doing is anything to do with those basic guiding principles.
right. That's really important. That's a really beautiful thing to think about and to call out.
Yeah. So like as you said, I don't want to get rid of them, but I don't think we're working on those anymore. We have done we're dealing with
Yeah,
some diluted algorithmic
yeah,
version of those principles that are
yeah,
lost. They're so far
yeah.
away.
And I think that's, part of, I mean, the reaction, all the restrictionism, I, I hate it because of, how it harms people and how wrong it is from a justice standpoint. But I think it's a pretty understandable impulse. And I think those
Totally.
people are sensing the mismatch too. The system's not working in the
Yeah.
way there's some conceptual sort of philosophical rethink that we need to do to figure out
No.
protect it's not like the need for protection, it's more urgent than ever, but the systems we have to provide protection
Are more
are
decrepit than ever.
decrepit. That's a good
Yeah. And also like I'm not trying to vilify those who are like, I'm scared, stop. Like I totally get it. Like that is also a
yeah,
perfectly reasonable trauma response. Like that
right.
makes
For
sense.
sure. Hmm.
I
Yeah.
get it. It's just it's not working and I don't think we're actually having an honest conversation about it at all.
Mm-mm. Right,
Not even a
right.
little.
No, people who defend asylum are still kind of holding on to what we have. And, of course, because if, we're in this conflict situation. So if we give it up, we end up with nothing, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's scared of that. But it's sort of a barrier to any kind of dialogue about where we move forward. And there's just zero trust. The
There's
lizard,
just zero
the
trust.
lizard brain is driving. There's so many people in so many situations right now that, but I mean, I partly too, I do have moments of optimism because I think, if you look at history, and I think you spoke to this, times of great, or, when things fall apart is when new things are born. There's sort
Yes.
of a dialectical quality about history that, it's hard to see where that's going to go. Yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, and that's why sometimes I just have to remind myself that the pendulum swings. Like that's just how
Hmm.
the world goes. And that like the fact that we are peaking off on this side hopefully
Yeah.
means we're in the process of coming back in the other direction. So
Hopefully. I mean,
yeah,
the stuff you mentioned about neuroscience, I think that's hopeful. I mean, I think there are understandings at different places, different people operating in our system that are at least pointing out little clues to where things could go. Yeah, a richer, sort of more psychologically and spiritually richer understanding of
yes,
all this stuff would be helpful.
all of that. And I think that as a final kind of point is that I've been thinking a lot about like resilience and, like you
Yeah,
mentioned spirituality. That's how I get there is that it's very easy to vilify refugees and da da da.
the
Um,
other.
yeah, the other, right? But when you actually deal with those individuals on a day-to-day
Right.
basis who have survived incredible
Oh
atrocity,
my
they're
gosh.
so inspirational, like
Exactly.
truly
Truly.
inspirational.
Hmm.
And so to be like, this is fraud, this is bogus, like um,
Yeah.
the whole thing kind of falls away because it's like,
Hmm.
okay, can you just talk to this person? Can you
Right.
just
I
like
know.
bask in the
Right.
richness of how they are able to be kind and
Yes.
empathetic
Yeah.
and
To
I
go
don't
through the
know.
things they do and not lose their humanity is, I mean,
Yeah.
I get inspiration from that every day.
Oh my God. Yeah. And
That's one
like
of the
I've
richest things
worked
about this practice, right?
totally. And you and I have talked about like corporate practice versus refugee practice. My refugee clients are the most delicate, gentle. They never pressure me. They never place demands. Like it's just a total. And when I do work that's like solicitors files, it's a very different ball game. It's
Hmm.
the rigor of that kind of practice because,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying that that's wrong, I'm just saying that there are two different stylistics and they both have their own place, but I think that there's not a um I feel like the demonization of one side and the deification of the other one
Hmm. Right,
is losing a lot.
right. I'm working
Yeah.
with this. I do a little bit of sideline of religious worker visas, typically for Tibetan Buddhist
Huh.
monks and lamas and stuff. And so, anyhow, I'm working with this Buddhist center, and it's Bhutanese tradition. So the lama who runs it is is Bhutanese, and we had a meeting few weeks ago, and it was so sweet because we were talking about some of this stuff, and he's like, we need more compassion. We
Hmm.
need more understanding and compassion.
Yeah.
It's not a complex policy-based thing. It's just like we need more compassion.
Yeah, period.
So,
Yeah.
I
We just need
really
more
try to carry
kindness,
that.
honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. No, I have a very similar situation with an existing client where it's like we're trying to score him on this comprehensive ranking system score, which looks only at age, number of degrees, amount of money, because we're looking at provincial nominees, like all these things. And he's like
Yeah.
taken an oath of, you know,
Right.
like all these oaths
Right.
of like poverty and like
Right.
not to,
Yeah.
and so like it's like fundamentally uh, but he's a spiritual, like a community healer. He's
Yeah.
really rallying this whole community, and it's like, sorry, Canada doesn't value this contribution
That.
because
Right.
we
The
we want
richness
to
that he
see your
has.
money. Yeah, we want to see your money and your
Oh,
degrees. And anyways, it's
goodness.
a funny paradigm.
It sure is.
I
Yeah.
have really enjoyed this conversation, Chris, as
Yeah. It was really
usual.
fun. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure we'll find another way for our paths to cross.
Sounds good. All right.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks so
Thanks.
much.
Thanks so much.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.